For the first session, this will be run in a different manner than the other sessions, and so I'm going to introduce the moderator for this session, and he will introduce the speakers. Ralph Cavanaugh is a senior staff member at the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, where he directs the energy program. He is a lawyer by training, and I guess not a physicist. At least I couldn't find that in his background. He earned his law degree from Yale in 1977 and has worked tirelessly and to great effect in trying to get energy efficiency measures implemented. He was awarded in 1996 the Heinz Award, which noted his work in persuading legislators and regulators to permit utilities to earn money for saving energy. What a concept. And with that, let me turn the podium over to Ralph to introduce our speakers for the first session.
Thank you. This and every session today, like the man we honor, will combine rigor, exuberance, and good humor. It will range in scope freely from the global to the local, frequently in concrete example, but it will include no hint of complacency because Art's work and your work is not yet done. We're going to invite your questions. For this session, it'll come after the 4 presentations, and we'll pass mics through the hall, and we'll want you to be part of this session, and I invite you to be thinking about that. But we're going to begin with John Holdren, who is going to address global energy challenges and the role of energy efficiency. And I take a certain mischievous delight in introducing John Holdren to this audience. About half of you have already pointed out that his biography is incomplete. Yes, it is relevant and appropriate to note in the program that he holds 2 chairs at Harvard, including the Teresa and John Hines Professorship of Environmental Policy, that he is director of the world-renowned Woods Hole Research Center. But you will all be gratified to know that his official Harvard biography still prominently notes that 23 years ago, that he co-founded and for 23 years co-led the campus-wide program on energy and resources right here at the University of California at Berkeley. And would you all please join me now in welcoming John Holdren back home.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and thank you all. My only problem is figuring out this touchpad. Hang on a second.
Are you good?
Want
to escape the whole thing?
Yeah, I'm going to do this, and then we'll get it.
There you are.
I think I'm here.
No.
Oh, you think I'm there?
I named you.
You renamed me. All right.
Because everybody's Rosenfeld, right?
Okay. Yes, no, I just had my name too far back. All right.
Excellent.
Okay, we got it. Well, again, thank you all very much. It's a tremendous pleasure and opportunity to be able to launch the substantively energy-focused part of this symposium honoring Art Rosenfeld on his 80th birthday, and also, of course, honoring him on the receipt of the Fermi Prize, which I said in an email to him yesterday is long overdue, but it does come at a wonderful moment. Let me start the task of talking about the energy challenges facing the world and the role of energy efficiency in them by talking about the multiple aims that energy policy needs to address if it is to succeed. Those aims fall in 3 categories, the first of which is economic. Of course, an absolutely crucial part of the problem which the world has inadequately addressed up until now is meeting the energy needs of the poor. A second economic aim, obviously, is reliably meeting the fuel and electricity needs of growing economies everywhere. There is, of course, also an interest in limiting the costs of energy to consumers, and there is a powerful interest in limiting the cost and vulnerability that we experience from our dependence on imported oil. A second category is environmental. This will not surprise people who know me, of whom there are many in this room. One could list many environmental aims. I list 4 here having to do with urban and regional air quality, avoiding nuclear energy mishaps, limiting the impacts of energy development on fragile ecosystems, and, as I will argue, perhaps most importantly, limiting the contribution of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion to the growing risks we're experiencing from climate change. There's also a set of homeland and national security aims that energy policy needs to address, minimizing the dangers of going to war over oil and gas resources, avoiding the spread of nuclear weapons from the spread of nuclear energy technologies, reducing the vulnerability of our energy systems to terrorist attack, and again, I would argue, probably most importantly, avoiding energy blunders that perpetuate or create deprivation. That's important in the security domain because deprivation is the root cause of much of the political instability, frustration, and despair that ultimately leads to conflict in the world. I want to emphasize that running out of resources is not the heart of, or even particularly relevant to, the energy problems we face. It may be that the world is running out of cheaply and reliably deliverable conventional oil and gas, both in the sense that these energy forms are getting more costly and less reliable, and in the sense that it's not clear how much longer we will be able to increase the production of conventional oil and gas in order to meet rising demands. But the fact is that other energy resources are really immensely abundant, capable in principle of being expanded to meet many times the world's current energy demand. This lists the world's estimated ultimately recoverable energy resources in units of terawatt years, which enables you to relate the world's current rate of energy use, which is about 16 terawatt years per year, or in simpler terms, 16 terawatts. These are not the reserves, by the way, which are only the amount of material that has already been discovered and that is economically exploitable with today's technology. These are estimates of what will ever be discovered and will ever be exploitable at future prices and with future technology. But what you see is there's 5 to 10 times as much coal as there is conventional oil and natural gas. There's 5 or 6 times as much methane clathrates and geopressured gas as there is coal, similar amount of low-grade oil shale. Nuclear resources are larger still. And the renewable energy resources are truly immense. 100,000 terawatt years per year of sunlight reaches the surface of the Earth, 30% of it on the land. That means that simply covering 1% of the land area with collectors that could convert solar energy to usable forms at 20% efficiency would yield about 4 times the present world rate of energy use. Wind, a small fraction of that, but still immense. The harvestable wind energy potential, referring really to the windiest areas on Earth, expressed as generated electricity, would be between 1.3 and 3 times the 2005 world electricity generation. Biomass, referring to solar energy stored by photosynthesis on land alone, is about 60 terawatt years per year. And using some of that for energy crops at twice the average terrestrial photosynthetic yield would give something in excess of world oil use in 2004. So it's not a matter, when we talk about energy challenges, it's not a matter of running out of energy. The bigger problems are 2. One is tensions among the different energy policy aims that I mentioned. Examples of those tensions include the tension between wanting on the one hand to minimize costs and on the other hand to modernize our energy systems, to increase their robustness and their reliability, to improve their environmental characteristics. Those aims are often in tension. Obvious tension between a desire on the one hand to increase domestic fossil fuel production for purposes of economic security, in tension with the desire to protect fragile ecosystems, offshore environments, Alaskan environments, and the like. Third big tension, the desire on the part of many to increase the production of nuclear energy as a way to contribute to the need to abate greenhouse gas emissions, versus, on the other hand, a desire to reduce risks from accidents and terrorism associated potentially with nuclear energy. The other big problem that makes this whole issue so problematic is that there is no silver bullet. No known or imagined energy option is free of liabilities and uncertainties, and I like to summarize those, and some of you who've taken my courses over the years have seen an earlier version of this. I like to summarize this in a terse set of questions. Oil and gas, not enough resources. The more abundant fossil fuels, the question is whether there's enough atmosphere in the sense of the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb without intolerable consequences the emissions that result from using those fossil fuels. In the case of biomass, it's a matter of competition for land with agriculture, forestry, and other purposes, ecosystem function among them. Wind and hydro, limited by the number of good sites. The question with photovoltaics is, can we make them cheap enough? The question with nuclear fission is whether it's too unforgiving of human frailties of various kinds. Both stupidity and malice could be mentioned. Nuclear fusion, the question with nuclear fusion is whether it's too hard. After 50 years of effort and probably $30 billion of investment worldwide, it still, in the best machines we have, uses twice as much energy as it produces, not a terrific characteristic in an energy option. Hydrogen, of course, is not an energy source. It takes energy to make it, and then we have to figure out how to store it. And end-use efficiency, whose virtues I will extol at the end of the talk, is nonetheless also not a silver bullet. The question is, are there enough smart end users to realize its potential? And if there aren't enough smart ones to start with, can we educate them fast enough? Something that Art has devoted a substantial portion of his career to trying to address. What then must a successful energy policy do? A successful energy policy, first of all, has to help society to identify and to deploy a suitable mix of the energy options, both supply and end use, that are currently available on the menu from which firms and consumers can choose. A mix that yields somehow a decent compromise among the competing economic and environmental and security objectives that I mentioned. But the second thing a successful energy policy has to do is to promote technological advances that improve that menu over time, that reduce the limitations of existing energy options, that reduce the uncertainties, that open new options, and that, very importantly, reduce the tensions among the different energy policy objectives that we've been talking about. It's important to understand, I think probably everybody in this room does, that those ends are not going to be achieved automatically by market forces alone. That is so because many of the objectives, as you will have noticed, relate to public goods and externalities. Public goods like meeting the energy needs of the poor, building national security, externalities like pollution and climate change risks. And those public goods and externalities are not priced in markets unless policies achieve that. Secondly, of course, as again I think we all know, markets often need other kinds of policy help in order to avoid the standard litany of market failures, monopoly power, lack of information, perverse incentives, short time horizons, and so on. It's crucial to keep in mind that improved technologies would help a lot. Improved technologies would help us reduce oil demand and limit imports without incurring excessive economic or environmental costs. They'd help us improve air quality even while meeting the growing demand for automobiles, which, even if we can slow it down in the United States, will be harder to slow down in China and India and Brazil and the like. Improved technologies would make it possible to use our abundant coal resources without having utterly intolerable impacts on regional air quality and acid rain. They could help us expand the use of nuclear energy while at the same time reducing accident and proliferation risks, and they could help us achieve and sustain economic prosperity worldwide while at the same time controlling the risks from global climate change. But again, I want to emphasize that technology doesn't arise by itself and it doesn't diffuse by itself. We need policy in conjunction with technology improvements. We need policy to provide the incentives and the scale and the continuity and the coordination of effort that will be required to realize in a timely way the potential of technological innovations that's out there. We need policy to gain the potential benefits of market competition in the electricity sector while at the same time protecting public goods. We need policy to ensure that the technological innovations that we do develop diffuse rapidly, and not just in the most prosperous countries and sectors around the world, but in the least prosperous countries and sectors around the world. And finally, and perhaps most difficult, we're going to need better policies in order to attain an equitable, adequate, and achievable cooperative framework for limiting greenhouse gas emissions all over the world. Now, in this list of challenges, I submit that two are more difficult than all the others. First one is the oil dependence challenge, and increasingly a parallel challenge that starts to emerge as gas markets also become global, as the oil market has long been. How do we reduce the economic vulnerability that arises from our dependence on these energy forms overall, and the balance of payments and foreign policy liabilities that arise from the import part of those dependencies, in spite of the fact that demand is growing in the transport sector, particularly for liquid fuel, and in the residential and industrial and electric utility sector for gas. And the second of the two biggest challenges is the climate challenge. How do we provide the affordable energy services needed to create and sustain prosperity everywhere without entraining unmanageable disruption of global climate by greenhouse gases from fossil fuel use? These would be difficult challenges indeed if they were challenges only for the industrialized countries, but the stakes are higher and the difficulties are higher for the developing countries, and the solutions require that we all get it right, because the oil market is global and the climate system is global. These problems cannot be fixed by what any country alone does, even what the richest, most powerful, and most consuming country in the world does alone. Let me elaborate a little bit on the magnitude of the challenges. This just shows how heavily dependent we still are on oil and gas in the world at the opening of the 21st century. In fact, the world energy system is increasingly dominated by oil and gas. We are, in terms of fossil fuel dependence altogether, nearly 80% dependent on fossil fuels in today's world, even when you count, as most official tabulations do not, the traditional biomass energy forms that still are the main source of energy for the 2 billion poorest people in the world. They're often not counted because they're not marketed, but they've been estimated here in the green band at the bottom, and even with those in there, we're nearly 80% fossil fuel dependent in this world. That dependence is projected by all the standard projections to continue. This is the Energy Information Administration 2005 International Energy Outlook projections, and they just have oil and natural gas and coal going up and up and up. A lot of that oil is now traded. 63% of world oil production is traded. The share of natural gas that's traded is growing. United States, we all know that the oil import dependence of the United States has been growing, notwithstanding the reduction in the oil intensity of our economy and the reduction in the energy intensity overall, which we'll come to talking about. But basically, under all of the scenarios that the Energy Information Administration looks at, the oil dependence, the oil import dependence of the United States only grows. If you look at where those imports are coming from, they are destined to come increasingly from the Persian Gulf for the elementary reason that corresponds to the reason Willie Sutton said he robbed banks. That's where the money is. We're going to the Persian Gulf because that's where the oil is, and we're going there increasingly. Interestingly enough, surprise to many people, developing Asia's dependence on Persian Gulf oil is already bigger than North America's, and it is expected to grow faster than North America's, and you have to think about the geopolitical and the security implications of that. Continuing with the magnitude of the challenges, I'll turn to climate change. What climate change puts at risk? I suggest that climate change is the most dangerous of all human impacts on the environment from any origin, not only of all energy's environmental impacts, but all environmental impacts, period. It's the most dangerous because climate is the envelope within which all other environmental conditions and processes have to function. And if you distort that envelope enough, as we are well on our way to doing, you impair the functioning of every other aspect of environmental conditions and processes on which human well-being depends, and that's a lot of them. Climate governs the productivity of farms and forests and fisheries. It governs the prevalence of oppressive heat and humidity, the geography of disease, the damages that we have to expect from severe storms, from floods, from droughts, from wildfires, the property losses to be expected from sea level rise, the expenditures on engineered environments, how many dams, how many dikes, how much indoor environment, air-conditioned, even the distribution and abundance of species. And it's not only the most dangerous, it is the most difficult because the core cause of the problem is carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, and that, as I've already mentioned, is 80% of our energy supply worldwide. The energy system that is built today to deliver 80% of the energy from fossil fuels represents roughly a $12 trillion investment that turns over under ordinary circumstances on a time scale of 30 to 40 years. If you decide the energy system we need is not the one we have, you cannot change it overnight. You do not turn over a $12 trillion investment in 30, 40, 50-year lifetime facilities overnight at all. And those technologies that are out there now are not easily or cheaply adapted to capture and sequester the emissions of carbon dioxide. Quick set of pictures, 1,000 years of global carbon emissions, carbon dioxide concentrations, and temperature rise. There is no question among serious analysts of these matters that fossil fuel burning has changed the atmosphere and is changing the climate. Land use change has contributed to that and is not negligible, but the dominant source of the increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere for the last 100 years has been fossil fuels. Where we're headed for under what many people call business as usual, you take a scenario in the middle of the scenarios produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you end up with energy quadrupling in the century we're now in, the economy tentupling. You can see in this business as usual energy efficiency improvements continue. We'll come back to that. This is not a no energy efficiency improvement scenario. It's a continuation of the trajectory we've been on, energy efficiency improving at about 1% per year. Carbon emissions more than triple under this business as usual scenario. And here's where it takes us. The business as usual would be right in the middle of the band. This is 1,000 years of Earth temperature history, reconstructed from paleoclimatological indicators. The instrumental record in red for the last roughly 150 years, and the projections of where the temperature is going. The key point here is that global average surface temperature is not so much important in itself as it is an index of the state of the climate. What you have to understand is what we're talking about here is not a little bit of warming that makes it possible to swim a little later in the year, to plant one's garden a little earlier in the year. One is talking about a change in the climatic state, all of the patterns of hot and cold, wet and dry, ocean circulation, wind patterns that govern all these other environmental conditions and processes we depend on. And we're headed for a climatic state that is not only outside the range of natural variation for the last 1,000 years, it's outside the range experienced in the tenure of Homo sapiens on Earth. Raises the question, how much deflection from business as usual is required? Climate policy aim that has been negotiated in the process of formulating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which, by the way, was signed by the senior President Bush in 1992 and ratified by the United States Senate. Most members of that body seem to have forgotten that we have ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but never mind. The goal in that document, to which we are party, is stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. There was no consensus at the time as to what that level is, and there is still no consensus about what that level is, but one has to point out that significant impacts in terms of floods, droughts, wildfires, species, and melting ice are already apparent at 0.8 of a degree centigrade above pre-industrial global average surface temperature. That's where we are today, 0.8 of a degree. And the current greenhouse gas concentrations, if you could stop dead in our tracks, commit us, because of the momentum in the climate system, the thermal inertia of the ocean, commit us to 0.6 of a degree centigrade more. And of course, we can't stop in our tracks. It's increasingly clear that an increase of 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial could mean the end of coral reefs and the end of polar bears. That 2 degrees C could mean catastrophic melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. That an increase of 2.5 degrees centigrade could sharply reduce crop yields worldwide. And what that means is that stopping at a doubling of pre-industrial carbon dioxide, 550 parts per million, which in the middle of the range of what models project for this, would correspond to about 3 degrees centigrade increase in global average surface temperature. Was once thought to be a reasonable target by many. It's almost certainly not good enough to stop at 550 parts per million. Let me, before going on, just say a couple of words about the bad news concerning the two big challenges I've talked about, oil dependence and climate change, before turning to the good news, which is embedded in the potential for energy efficiency to make a big dent in this problem. First, the bad news. If the oil problem is a 600-pound gorilla that's already in the room, the climate change problem is an 800-pound gorilla that's beating down the door. Rapidly emerging science connected with the climate problem, improved understandings, and not just from models, but from better understanding of the paleoclimatological effort and from observations of what's happening now, are telling us that dangerous anthropogenic interference is already here. We're committed to avoiding it, but it's already here. And tipping points of a variety of kinds are quite possibly close. Second piece of bad news is that some approaches to reducing oil dependence and trying to address that challenge actually make the climate problem worse. For example, substitutes for conventional oil and gas in the form of coal to liquids, oil shale, tar sands, without carbon capture and sequestration technology, will make the carbon dioxide problem worse, even as they are making a dent in the oil dependence problem. Now here's the good news. The good news relates, of course, and it's time finally for the good news in this talk, to the role of energy efficiency. The good news is that increasing energy end-use efficiency is a relatively low-cost, sometimes negative cost, high-leverage approach to both reducing oil dependence and reducing climate change risks at the same time. And one sees in this graph, first of all, what, again, everybody in this room already knows. The amount of energy needed per dollar of real GDP has been falling across all the industrial countries, not just in the United States. Energy intensity has been declining in developing countries as well as in industrial ones. This is from the World Energy Assessment Update in 2004, showing the figures for the United States and for China on purchasing power parity corrected basis. And what we need to ask is how much harder do we need to push this pace of energy efficiency improvement in order to solve the problems I've been talking about. Here's an indication of how much harder we have to push the pace in relation to oil dependence in the United States. This is a composite picture from the President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology study in 1997 of energy R&D strategy for the United States, and a DOE study of 2003 that just looks at the oil futures in terms of what the potential contributions to reducing oil imports are of a variety of supply-side and demand-side approaches. And the supply side are on the bottom. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, optimistically evaluated, is the pink above the purple projection of domestic supply. Very aggressive program of expanding biomass liquids to replace oil is the bright blue above ANWR. And then you look at the size of the dent that could be made by advanced automobile technologies, light truck technologies, heavy truck technologies across the top. And you see, number one, we need a whole lot more than what we've been getting. And number two, the potential of what we could get is bigger on the demand side than it is on the supply side. Let's look at a similar set of questions for the CO2 issue. Here are a set of emissions trajectories consistent with different stabilization levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The orange at the top is more or less the middle-of-the-road IPCC scenario, which I showed in tabular form before. The green in the middle is the doubling trajectory, 550 parts per million. The gold line below the green is a line corresponding to a target of not exceeding a best estimate of 2 degrees centigrade in global average surface temperature. The gold, as you can see, by how much sooner it deflects and how much more steeply it goes down, is a much more challenging target than the 550 part per million target. And one can do a sort of interesting thought experiment. I mean, let's take the modest case. Imagine for a moment, suspend disbelief, and imagine that the green curve is good enough, that 550 parts per million will do. You can do a little thought experiment on the back of a medium-sized envelope, as again my students will appreciate. It starts from the point that in the year 2000 we were getting about 100 exajoules a year in the world from renewables and nuclear energy, carbon-free energy sources, if you assume that the biomass is being sustainably harvested, so you're growing it as fast as you're burning it. In that same year, fossil fuels were 350 exajoules a year. And under business as usual economic growth, you can figure out what additional amount of carbon-free energy supply you need as a function of the rate of reduction of energy intensity around the world. And what you find is that under business as usual, if the ratio of energy to real GDP falls at 1% per year around the world, you need 600 exajoules of carbon-free energy by 2050 and 1,500 exajoules of carbon-free energy by 2100 in order to stay on the 550 part per million stabilization trajectory. So you need 6 times as much in 2050 as we had in 2000 and 15 times as much in 2100 as in the year 2000. If over the whole world and over the whole century you can improve the efficiency of energy end use half again as fast as business as usual, so energy intensity declines at 1.5% per year, you now get to the point where you only, in quotes, only need as much carbon-free energy by 2050 as you were getting from fossil fuels in the year 2000, and you need 8 times as much carbon-free energy in 2100 as you were getting from fossil fuels. Big leverage, but not enough. Only, and this should be, there's a typo in the bottom line, it should be energy over GDP again. Only if you double the rate of energy improvement all over the world and over the whole century can you achieve a situation in which by 2100 you only need as much carbon-free energy, nuclear, renewable, and advanced fossil with carbon capture and sequestration as you were getting from fossil fuel in the year 2000. The leverage, obviously, of energy efficiency is immense. I conclude with U.S. and California energy use, the Rosenfeld Effect. This is Art's slide. I borrowed it from him. You can see the effect on California's per capita energy use of Art Rosenfeld entering the energy arena in 73, 74. There are a couple concluding messages from this. One, sharply increasing the rate of improvement of energy efficiency is the indispensable cornerstone of what we need to be doing nationwide and worldwide. Number 2, California has shown the way, and Art Rosenfeld showed California the way. Number 3, we need to clone him. Number 4, if we can't clone him, imitating him we'll have to do. And finally, in the United States, we need to turn more red states to blue. Thank you very much.
John has established the perfect transition to the next address, which is on the Rosenfeld effect in California. That is an integrated presentation, and I will introduce all 3 of the presenters now. And in doing so, a note of context. Art Rosenfeld's epiphany was magnificent, but it was not self-executing. Here in California, a whole generation of compelling advocates in government, in business, in academia, in public interest groups have been inspired by Art's vision and have worked to make it work right here in California. Many of them are here in this audience, and 3 of the very best of them are up on the stage. Sheryl Carter is Director of Western Energy Programs. Audrey Chang is Staff Scientist. Devra Wang is California Energy Program Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Now, those are names that are known and respected by every California policymaker and business leader with an interest in energy issues, with an interest in solving the problems that John Holdren described. And as they describe the Rosenfeld effect in California, as they are uniquely equipped to do, there is an inevitable omission in their remarks that I wish now to correct. Because they are going to tell you about extraordinary developments in California, many of them gratifyingly recent, without giving you any hint whatever that they may have had something to do with them. And that is that reluctance to claim credit is part of the secret of their success, but for purposes of this morning, Art and I didn't want them to get away with it altogether. The remarks from this group will begin with Sheryl Carter.
Good morning. I'll just go ahead and get started here while the technical difficulties are being worked out. Audrey, Devra, and I are going to talk today about the many substantive and tangible contributions that Art Rosenfeld has made to the energy efficiency field, and also to the substantial impacts in terms of gadgets invented, methods produced, centers founded, energy money saved, as well as environmental impacts reduced. However, perhaps the greatest contribution that Art has made is not so easily measured and is illustrated by the people in this room. And that is expressed in terms of throughout his career, Art has worked closely with, has taught, and has also inspired many of today's, or most of today's, energy efficiency leaders. Devra Wang and Audrey Chang are scientists following in Art's footsteps. Both have been trained in the hard sciences, Devra in bioengineering, and also Audrey in energy engineering. And both have decided to dedicate their careers to reducing the environmental and public health impacts of our energy production and use, and also to energy efficiency. We're banking on them and many of the people in this audience to become a whole army of Art Rosenfelds, because that's what it's going to take, is a whole army of Art Rosenfelds to address our environmental and economic challenges that we face today. Energy efficiency is the quickest, cleanest, and cheapest solution to our energy challenges, our environmental and economic solutions that we have. Art recognized this before most, but because of the advances that he helped make in energy efficiency, particularly in energy efficient lighting and controls like motion sensors, Art no longer has to go around hunting for light switches in offices and turning them off behind his coworkers, as he did on that fateful night in November of 1973. That night began Art's quest to save energy efficiently, and the result of that quest is the Rosenfeld Effect. Nowhere is that effect illustrated better than in California. Art made us better than anyone else at saving energy efficiently. In California, electricity use per capita has remained relatively steady for the last 30 years, whereas in the United States as a whole, the per capita electricity use has gone up about 50%. Over this time, we have saved in California more than 12,000 megawatts of peak demand. That's 24 giant power plants. Energy efficiency is a resource and makes up about 15% of our energy needs today in California. This has been done not at a cost to our economy, but at a very significant and tangible benefit. California's economic output per unit of electricity produced has gone up by about 40%. Over that same period of time, productivity has only gone up per unit of electricity produced in the United States as a whole by 8%. This continues to clearly demonstrate that increased economic growth and economic health need not be proportionally related to increased energy consumption. Or we could put it another way. Before Art made the switch to the energy efficiency field from theoretical physics in the early 70s, California's per capita electricity consumption was rising at about the same rate as the rest of the country. The first blip downward that you see in California could have been the energy crisis, or it could have been the moment that Art made the switch. You decide. His work in creating the energy analysis design tool for buildings, DOE2, which many of you are familiar with, and thus instigating Title 20 and 24, California's Efficient Appliance Standards and Building Codes, continued this steady trend of stable per capita electricity consumption. He founded ACEEE around 1980, and you might notice in the United States per capita line up there a bit of a dip in the U.S. per capita consumption as well at that period of time. So it should surprise no one then that with his appointment to the CEC in 2000 and his subsequent reappointment by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005, as well as the announcement of his Enrico Fermi Award, designating him as the father of energy efficiency, which of course we already knew, by President Bush yesterday, we will soon begin seeing this California per capita electricity consumption line dipping downward. We didn't get to 15% of our electricity use with any one approach or measure. It required an integration of research, incentive programs, and codes and standards. All have contributed together to this progress, and it's impossible to separate out their contributions. Without a steady stream of research and development of new, more efficient advanced technologies, incentive programs to commercialize and get these advanced technologies out into the market and accepted by consumers and the market, and building codes and appliance standards to lock these improvements in and continue on with our innovations, we would have 24 more giant power plants serving California's power needs than we do, and our air would be dirtier and our electricity bills would be higher. A new generation of emerging technologies could increase energy efficiency by as much again or more, and it will. We desperately need continued research and development to produce a steady stream of energy efficiency technologies so that we can meet our energy as well as our global warming reduction goals. When Art decided to make the switch to the energy efficiency field from theoretical physics in the early 1970s, there were virtually no research laboratories or graduate degrees programs specializing in the field. Art co-founded ACEEE and the Energy Efficiency Building Programs, which changed its name later to the Center for Building Science at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories. Now known as the Building Technologies Department, it continues to pump out exciting new and advanced energy efficient technologies. Continued advances in windows, in daylighting, in lighting technologies like the Berkeley lamp, controls and communication technologies, commercial building monitoring systems, and more. Also in the early 1970s, the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley was formed with John Holdren. Art, of course, was vice chair. ERG went on to train many leaders in the energy efficiency field. In fact, it seems like every other person I work with, including Devra Wang, is an ERGie. We need more of these types of training centers, and Devra will be talking about an exciting new center that Art helped create and helped make happen. High-frequency ballasts were one of the early advanced technologies developed out of the Energy Efficient Buildings program at LBL. Originally applied to the larger, more commercial fluorescent lamps, they increased these lamps' efficiency by more than 30%. Philips saw the potential for smaller ballasts and therefore more compact lamps, and the CFL was born. Even though they would burn for 10,000 hours versus the 750 hours for incandescents, and they saved more than 75% of the energy, CFLs were originally quite expensive, $25 per bulb. It just didn't pencil out, but Art and California saw the promise. Through a series of incentive programs and ever more stringent standards, those costs have been brought down significantly, and the quality of the product has been increased. Standardized testing procedures now exist to ensure this. The new utility energy efficiency programs that Devra will be talking about rely on more efficient lighting for a significant portion of the residential savings, much of this from CFLs. The center also invented the low-E technology that makes most windows sold today more efficient. Art also personally developed the DO2 computer program for the analysis and design of energy-efficient buildings. These technologies and others have saved us billions of dollars here in California and in the U.S., and we've just barely begun to scratch the surface. Art certainly isn't done, and we shouldn't be either. Is it any wonder that a rare scene like this, Art basking in the sun, would likely fetch top dollar on eBay? Past RD&D built the foundation that California's energy system stands on today. It is entirely fitting that Art is now the presiding member of the RD&D committee at the Energy Commission for PEER, continuing on in his contribution to provide a steady stream of ever more advanced and more efficient emerging technologies. The PEER program stimulates substantial private market investments in RD&D and provides widespread economic and environmental benefits. The economic benefits are 2 to 5 times greater than the investments themselves. The CPUC, which ART also helped with through the utility programs, established the Emerging Technologies Program, which helps in demonstrating, debugging, and creating successful pathways from RD&D to commercialization. This is often one of the biggest stumbling blocks to emerging technologies. It is important that we continue this investment in research and development here in California. And right now, there's a bill in the legislature, Senate Bill 1250, by Senator Parada, that is essential to continuing on for the next 5 years of peer program funding. So I'm hoping that folks in the audience will pay attention to this bill and support it. But of course, all of this RD&D has to go somewhere, and it has to actually be used and applied. And indeed, it has, as evidenced by the story that Audrey and Devra are about to tell. And I now turn it over to my colleague, Audrey Chang.
So while Art was conducting his research at LBL, he also turned to think about other aspects of energy efficiency. And perhaps the title here is a bit overstated, but there's no denying that Art has played a tremendous role in helping develop California's building and appliance standards, Title 24 and Title 20. So in the mid-70s, a few years after Art started looking at the energy efficiency issue, he worked with David Goldstein, our very own David Goldstein from NRDC, and Art dared to imagine a low electricity future and authored the very first report on the potential for cost-effective standards to reduce energy consumption. So Art shopped the idea around, and during the process, he got a few comments from people on opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, some people said that as a physicist, he was underqualified to talk about efficiency, while oddly enough, others said that as a physicist, he was overqualified. But ultimately, California did listen, and California did establish both building and appliance standards. So since Title 24 and Title 20 were established 30 years ago, they have produced continued savings for California, both in energy savings and billions of dollars saved. And on average, they have avoided about 5 power plants of 500 megawatt size each decade. So I think that we can all agree that it turns out that as a physicist, Art is quite qualified to address efficiency. And on the building side, Art was actually involved with Title 24, as Sheryl mentioned, from the very start. And using the DOE2 precursor, he helps the CEC incorporate passive solar modeling into Title 24. And on the appliance side, again, working with David Goldstein, Art discovered that there wasn't any correlation between refrigerator electricity consumption and the price that consumers paid for them. So again, Art took his story on the road, and in 1977, California adopted its refrigerator standards to take out the least efficient refrigerator models. And this example was followed by several other states and ultimately nationally as well. And over time, the standards have been strengthened and driving the market to create even more efficient models. And the end result is that refrigerators today, compared to 30 years ago, use 75% less electricity, cost half as much, but then are also 20% larger and have more features. The National Refrigerator Standards, which of course trace their origins back to California, have saved the US 130,000 megawatts of new electricity supply compared to projections, equivalent to more than 250 power plants. To give you another sense of the dramatic efficiency improvements we made here in California, here's a graph of the projections for electricity demand in California that were made in the early 70s that I lifted from an old report. And note here it's a log scale on the left column, so we're talking about exponential growth here. So before energy efficiency really came onto the California stage, there's projections for electricity consumption through the year 2000. There's a high, a medium, and a low. And at that time in California, in 1972, there were projections that to meet California's demand, there would be power plants located up and down California's coast, spaced an average of 8 miles apart. So where did we end up, actually, in 2000? As you can see, we're well below any of those projections, even the lowest one of them. and with our load growth at about 2% a year. So we're a far cry from if we had followed that historic path that was set out at that time. And largely thanks to art and energy efficiency, we've avoided the need to build about 300 power plants to serve California's needs. And time again, we've seen that California consistently leads the field with its efficiency standards. Other states, as I mentioned, and the U.S. as a whole have copied California standards. For example, the most recent update to our appliance standards in 2004 were then adopted, the same set of standards were then adopted in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. And elsewhere in the world, Russia's new construction standards and China's lighting standards are both modeled after California's. And so you can see there's huge gains in efficiency elsewhere in the world, far beyond California's borders. And the question is not if there will be others to follow, but who's next. And you saw this graph already. We sort of suspected that there'd be similar graphs that you'd see throughout the day. But the bottom line is that whenever Art goes on his traveling roadshow to talk about efficiency, he makes sure to add a little bit of fun into it and have a great time. And in the end of the day, no matter what, his fire is infectious. And whenever we see that little twinkle in his eyes, we can't help but follow him on his next great idea. So why has California been so successful in energy efficiency? There's a policy framework that has been developed here in California with 7 elements, one for each year of Art's age in this picture here. The first one, as we've heard already, RD&D and standards are needed. We need the new technologies developed and then the standards to keep raising the bar. Second, we need to integrate energy efficiency into resource procurement. In other words, we need to make sure to look at efficiency as a resource. And indeed, efficiency is our #1 priority resource in California today. It's the concept of building efficiency power plants, where utilities use the money that they would use to build a power plant, a traditional power plant, and invest in efficiency instead. Third is to motivate utilities by decoupling revenues from sales. And I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on this because it's such an important part, and we'll come back to this list here. So Art has repeatedly emphasized that we need proper incentives to make sure that utilities are motivated to invest in efficiency. And the problem is here that the rest of the country still has it completely wrong. Under the status quo, utilities face a disincentive to invest in efficiency, since their financial health is directly tied to the volume of their energy sales. And so any conservation that reduces sales also hurts their financial health. And more specifically, the issue here is that utilities have fixed costs, which are sunk costs in physical equipment, and currently the authorized recovery of these costs is tied to sales. So if utilities end up selling more energy, they collect more for their fixed costs than authorized. And if they sell less, they don't recover as much as they are authorized. And what we've learned here in California is that we actually can solve the problem through modest regular true-ups in energy rates. So if sales are higher than expected, you return the over-collected revenues to customers through rate adjustments, and then vice versa. And these are adjustments that are so small that you'll hardly notice them. Typically, they're less than 2% of residential customers' bill, and that's about a nickel a day, up or down, for the typical California residential customer. And if the adjustments are done regularly, annually, there's no incentive anymore for the utilities to bump up their sales to recover their costs, and decreases in the sales on the other side won't hurt their financial health. And now this mechanism has been successfully implemented in all of California's investor-owned utilities. And the key result is that they no longer have a conflict in interest with efficiency, and it's a large part of the reason why California has been such a leader in efficiency. And of course, the next step now is to make sure that public power ends up following in the IOU's footsteps. So back to our policy framework here in California. Number 4 is to set energy-saving targets. In 2004, Art worked with his colleagues at the CEC and the PUC to set aggressive energy-saving targets for the state, aimed at capturing all cost-effective, achievable potential. Over the 10-year horizon of these goals, we will double our savings, and most importantly, as Sheryl mentioned, we'll start bending that per capita electricity curve downwards. Number 5 is well-designed programs, and Devra will be talking more about the first steps that we've taken to meet those aggressive goals. But we've seen time and time again that the nation and the world all look to California for examples for how to run their programs. Number 6 is the independent evaluation of savings. It's making sure that the savings that you think are there are actually there. And ART, of course, has played a role in developing monitoring and verification protocols. Last on the list is performance-based incentives. It's not enough simply just to remove disincentives, but we also, as ART has emphasized, need to provide a direct incentive for utilities to invest in energy efficiency. So reward them for good performance and penalize them for bad performance. But we need to be careful about how we do this. We don't want to, as ART has said, reward large, dumb investments, but instead, a shared savings approach allows utilities to share in the benefits of efficiency based on how much energy is saved rather than how much is spent. So now I'll pass on the torch to Devra to talk about some of the more current events and a look at the future as well.
So at this point, I'm sure you're all wondering, how could one man have accomplished so much? But the good news is that ART is far from finished with his path-breaking work, and if I had to bet on it, the most exciting years are yet to come. As Audrey described, all of the attention that ART has paid to establishing a model policy framework for energy efficiency in California, and a framework that will ensure that we have a long-term, sustained commitment to energy efficiency here, has immediately paid off. Just earlier this year, ART and his friend Susan Kennedy, who was his fellow commissioner at the PUC before becoming the governor's chief of staff, ART and Susan together launched the most aggressive energy efficiency program in the history of the utility industry. This program builds off of California's impressive accomplishments over the past 30 years, and as you can see in this graph, California will save more energy than ever before over the next 3 years. Now, to reach these impressive savings goals, the utilities are investing about $2 billion over the next 3 years to help every Californian save energy. The portfolio of programs to achieve these savings includes a mix of the tried and true programs that have reliably delivered savings over the years, as well as some new and exciting programs that include green building programs that take a more holistic look at reducing the environmental impact of our buildings. It includes partnerships with water utilities to take advantage of the synergies between water and energy efficiency, and to recognize that when we save water in California, we also save a lot of energy from avoided pumping and treatment of that water. It includes working with cities to provide expedited permitting for highly efficient buildings and local ordinances to require efficiency upgrades when buildings are sold, and pilots of on-bill financing to allow small businesses to finance their investments in energy-efficient purchases right on their utility bills. And perhaps most importantly, the portfolio of programs includes competitive solicitations for tens of millions of dollars that allows anyone with a good idea to propose how they can save California energy. Now, as always, ART has made sure that these are very good investments for California. The programs will be saving about $2 for every dollar that's invested in them, delivering a total of about $3 billion in net benefits over the next 3 years. These savings will be achieved by avoiding about 1,500 megawatts of generation and saving enough natural gas to meet the needs of about 100,000 households. That's enough for a city the size of Bakersfield. Now, all of this avoided burning of fossil fuels means that we're cutting down on pollution significantly as well, equivalent to taking about 650,000 cars off the road just by 2008. But of course, ART has not been content just with having improved the lives of 35 million Californians or even 300 million Americans. And so last year, he set off to take the lessons that we've learned here in California to China. Now, we'll hear more about the challenges and the opportunities that China faces from Dr. Levine after the break, but let me just tell you briefly about ART's trip to China last year. Art and Susan led a delegation of high-ranking California officials and executives from PG&E to China to gently break the news to them that they'd been wasting their money on the massive power projects, like the 1,000-megawatt coal-fired plants that they're building every week and the 18,000-megawatt Three Gorges Dam. As always, Art came very well prepared with his facts. He used this slide to show them that they could provide the same energy needs as the Three Gorges Dam by improving the efficiency of refrigerators and air conditioners, and that the efficiency savings would be twice as valuable as the energy produced by the dam. Now, as always, Art made a very convincing case. This visit led to a path-breaking agreement between China and California to cooperate on energy efficiency. Art and his colleagues signed an agreement with California's sister province of Jiangsu, which is a booming coastal region of about 75 million people, and additional informal agreements with Shanghai and the central government in Beijing to provide expertise and training to Chinese regulators and utility companies on energy efficiency. So his trip to China was a great success, but fortunately, Art has still had time for us here in California. He recently demonstrated once again how strong his ongoing commitment is to mentor the next generation of efficiency leaders and to draw more people into this important field. Art helped create a new Center on Energy Efficiency at UC Davis to ensure that California continues to have bright, motivated people working to help California use energy more efficiently for decades to come. Just 2 weeks ago, Governor Schwarzenegger proudly announced the launch of this center, and in his usual style, Art spent a few minutes rejoicing and then set about immediately scheming with Peter Darby, chairman and CEO of PG&E, about how to make the best use of PG&E's shareholders' $500,000 contribution to the center. Now, with all this success under his belt, Art is now turning his sights directly to address the most pressing issue of our time, global warming. Because Art has shown definitively that California can cut its emissions and prosper at the same time, California is now poised to lead the fight to stop global warming. As you can see here, California has reduced its per capita carbon dioxide emissions by 30% since 1975, when the state's efficiency efforts began in earnest. While the efficiency level, the carbon dioxide emission levels in the rest of the country have remained essentially flat during that time. And of course, during this period, California also grew to become the 6th largest economy in the world. Now, based on this proven success, last June, Governor Schwarzenegger announced global warming pollution reduction targets for the state to cut our pollution back to 2000 levels by 2010, back to 1990 levels by 2020, and down to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And as Art has proved time and again, these emission savings can be achieved while providing economic benefits to the state. Several independent economic analyses, including one from here at UC Berkeley, showed that the state can meet the governor's 2020 target while providing billions of dollars in economic benefits and tens of thousands of new jobs for Californians. The governor's climate action team outlined a whole package of strategies, dozens of strategies, that California should pursue in order to meet these targets. And California's legislative leaders now plan to put teeth into the governor's targets. A package of bills authored by Senate President Pro Tem Parada, Assembly Speaker Nunez, and Assemblywoman Pavley will ensure that California cuts its global warming pollution. Naturally, all of these bills stem from Art's work. Senate Bill 1368, authored by Pro Tem Parada, would codify a policy recommended by Art and his colleagues at the California Energy Commission to set a minimum standard for greenhouse gas emissions for any new long-term financial commitments to generation that our utilities make. With dozens of conventional coal-fired power plants in the planning stages throughout the West, many of which would like to sell to California, this policy is essential to ensure that we avoid any new commitments to outdated technologies that would prevent us from achieving our pollution reduction goals and that would likely become financial liabilities in very short order. It also sends a very clear signal to the market that California only wants to invest in new advanced technologies that will continue to serve us well for generations to come. Assemblyman Levine has also plans to address another key solution to global warming that Art has identified in AB 2021. We've described the enormous progress that California's investor-owned utilities have made on energy efficiency in recent years. But as Audrey noted, the state's publicly owned utilities, which provide about a quarter of the state's power, have fallen far behind. Public power must now accelerate their efficiency programs by 2 to 3-fold in order to contribute proportionally to the state's energy savings targets, and AB 2021 seeks to ensure that they do. Achieving these savings will cut carbon dioxide pollution by nearly 6 million tons by 2020 and provide an estimated $3 billion in net benefits. Now, Art has also taught us time and again that if you want the market to work properly, you have to send it the right signals. Assembly Bill 32, jointly authored by Speaker Nunez and Assemblywoman Pavley, would make California the first in the nation to cap statewide global warming emissions. And since California is the 12th largest emitter in the world, and since our policies are often adopted by other states and other countries, putting a lid on California's pollution could have a real impact on curbing global warming. AB 32 would also provide a boost to California's economy. By capping emissions, it would send a clear signal to the market that pollution-cutting technologies are profitable and help jumpstart the clean energy economy in California, making clean tech the new high tech that drives California's prosperity. So we are all incredibly lucky to have Art's talents focused on solving the most important issues facing our society today. As everyone who's had the pleasure of working with Art knows, the best part about him is not his incredible intellect or his unwavering focus on the most important issues in life, or even his caring nature. The best part about Art is his infectious enthusiasm and how he inspires people. He does everything with a big smile on his face and convinces even the most skeptical that we can achieve whatever we put our minds to. And as everyone who gets regular emails from Art at 11 p.m. knows, he has a wonderful and tolerant wife, Roz, who has been a large part of the secret to his success. So on behalf of the entire state of California, our children and our grandchildren, and in particular the hundreds of people in the efficiency community who you have mentored and who want to grow up to be just like you, we say a big thank you to Art and Roz.
All right, it's time to present these witnesses for cross-examination. The procedure we're going to follow for the whole day is, where's my friend Chris Caldwell on the right? None of you can probably get up to reach a mic, so we've got a couple of mobile ones, and I'm just going to look around. The only rules that apply to everybody but Art are be reasonably concise and ask a question. All right, so who wants to start? Who wants to start? All right, can you get a mic over to Bill?
This question is directed, I think, at John Holdren. And what do you think the probability is of globally meeting a 2-degree constraint with 2% reduction in global energy per GDP per capita? And if you can't meet it, what else could you do? For example, should we be looking more intelligently and more actively at adaptation technologies?
Thank you for that curveball, Bill. I think the probability of meeting a 2-degree C target is probably under 20%. I'd say between 10 and 20% shot at doing that at this juncture. If we had a few more Art Rosenfelds on the planet, the probability would go up substantially. But I think all of us have an obligation to aim in that vicinity and to do everything we can to up the odds, because I really think it looks increasingly problematic, and virtually every climatologist and ecologist I know think it looks increasingly problematic to live with 550 or higher. We do have to look at adaptation. We're already adapting. Climate is already changing. There's no way to avoid adaptation. There are a number of efforts underway to look more systematically and coherently at ways for adapting to climate change. But what everybody needs to understand is that adaptation is not an alternative to mitigation. We have no choice but to try to get the ceiling down. And the key insight, I think, about adaptation is adaptation works well for moderate changes. It gets increasingly expensive and increasingly ineffective as the magnitude of the climatic changes grows.
Who's next? Yeah.
It's one thing to, I don't know who I'm addressing this to, probably Art, but I can't address every question to Art. One can teach the Chinese energy efficiency and the wonders, and they can save a lot. And then I worry they'll just use this as an excuse to grow even faster, that they won't cut back on their coal plants. They will just cut back, they'll continue to grow as quickly as they can, and maybe even faster by using energy efficiency. I worry that this isn't solving the problem. So would someone please address that?
I'm going to take a...
We'll address it next, but John.
Yeah, I'm sure Mark will. Let me make one brief comment about that and see if others want to add anything. I think the saving grace in China is that the Chinese are much more concerned than most people in this country recognize about the impacts of climate change on themselves. If we had to rely on China responding on altruistic grounds or on grounds that the industrialized countries are telling them they need to cut back, we would have much less chance of success than we have in a situation in which the Chinese are worried about their glaciers going and the effect of that on the ebb and flow of their great rivers. They're worried about the effects of monsoon changes on China. The Chinese leaders I talk to are more informed person for person and level for level in their bureaucracy than their American counterparts. That may sound like a low bar, but but they are.
All right, over on this side. Yeah.
This is for Devra and our friends at NRDC. You mentioned one of California's big advantages is the legislation that decouples utility revenues from sales. You didn't mention that another one of our big advantages is that our energy efficiency standards are adopted on the basis of demonstrated cost effectiveness. They're not consensus standards. They don't have to, be the lowest common denominator that everybody thinks would be a good idea to adopt. And my question is, do you see other states or other nations setting the same kind of legislative foundation for standards, that they have to be technically based rather than just a consensus standard?
Well, you're absolutely right that California has been a very strong leader in terms of setting aggressive energy efficiency standards, both for appliances and for buildings. We have seen that other states, I think a dozen other states, have adopted many of the same appliance standards that California has adopted, as well as the federal government and other countries looking to us. There's an effort now underway by the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency to establish a national energy efficiency action plan to help bring essentially California's lessons and how to do energy efficiency right on programs and standards to the rest of the country. And so that should be kicking off this summer. Many of the folks are involved in that initiative, but I think we'll be seeing more and more states adopting California's model soon.
And I would just also add to that the Western Governors Association about a year and a half ago passed a clean energy initiative. Folks have been working on that for the last 18 months. The recommendations about to come out to be adopted hopefully by all of the Western states include stringent codes and appliance standards as well, following California's model.
Yes. Oh, no, sorry, on this side, and then we'll go to the right.
Are we supposed to stand?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Probably helpful if you stand up.
Okay. John and panel, distinguished panel, what do you say to people who say that we've really reached the end of our ability to become more efficient? We're just as efficient as we can be now. I don't believe that, but what is the quick response? What do you say to people like that?
All they have to do is look at a report put out a couple of years ago called California's Secret Energy Surplus to see that we have thousands of megawatts left. I believe it's 6,000 megawatts of cost-effective, achievable potential left in California to tap over the next 10 years. That doesn't take into account any new technologies and emerging technologies, only commercialized or near commercialized technologies. And that's after all of what you've seen California has accomplished over the years.
Now, this conversation is going to go on all day, but we've got to get back on schedule so we can actually all participate in all parts of it. So we're going to declare that the schedule calls for a brief break. You got to be back here at quarter up. We started quarter up. We're back off Berkeley's high again. We're going to stay on it. Bill, you all set?
Yeah, thank you.
See you at quarter up. Brief break.